You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 28th of November, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Russia attempts to condemn Ukraine to another cold, dark winter. The UK and the EU start speaking to each other properly again. And has one Australian state solved the eternal dilemma over the funding of politicians? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Michael Binion and Alyona Hlivko will discuss the day's big stories. And our weekly letter from is a letter from the United States, as millions of Americans travel home for Thanksgiving to eat turkey, watch the Detroit Lions win and the Dallas Cowboys lose, probably on form, and argue with their parents about Donald Trump. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Michael Binion, a foreign affairs specialist for The Times, and by Alyona Hlivko, who's a former regional Ukrainian MP, is the founder and CEO of St James's Foreign Policy Group, and an advisor to Lord Ashcroft on Ukraine. Michael, first of all, we should have bought a cake. It would need to be, to make it clear to our listeners, a cake the size of this table in order to accommodate all the requisite candles. But happy 80th birthday!
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I've had a blitz of publicity, which has been rather satisfying, gratifying, but yeah, now I've got, I think I'm entering my second childhood really before I've left the first one, so we'll have to
You were at the top of the list of the Times' birthdays on this day.
Well, that's awfully flattering. Yes, I was. Yes, I was with Steve Bannon next to me, so I'm not quite sure how that works.
That's slightly less flattering. It's a big deal, Michael. Like 80 years old, still very much a working journalist?
Yes, I'm still writing leaders for the Times. I've actually been at the same newspaper for 52 years, which does sound rather a long time. And you sort of think, gosh, isn't it time to move on?
Alyona, you, unsurprisingly perhaps, because you are in fact Ukrainian, have just returned from Ukraine, which we will be talking about a bit more in detail shortly. But coming up for the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of this, and facing yet another winter of this especially, what's your sense of how the mood is holding up?
The mood in Ukraine is unfortunately quite dire, I would say. And it was such a shift coming back to Christmassy London and seeing all the lights. And just for the first day, I couldn't believe how much happiness we're exposed to here in the West and in London. Just walking around the streets, feeling safe, feeling like we don't need to run to bomb shelters like we did in Ukraine. That was the week, indeed, that was quite intense. For Ukraine over a week, and that was the trip that we've done with a client of mine who you've mentioned, a great supporter of Ukraine, Lord Ashcroft, because he's still supporting quite a lot of initiatives on the ground, which is really reassuring. But that, of course, takes going to the most intense areas like Odessa, where we had to spend few hours every night in a shelter, and then Kyiv was attacked by drones every single night, and eventually ballistic missile flew into Ukraine, and then there was a strike on Kharkiv the same day that we were there. And that was only one working trip, whereas Ukrainians lived through that every single day for over 1,000 days now.
Well, we will start in Ukraine, where Russian President Vladimir Putin does not appear to be heeding any warnings against escalation which he may or may not have received from US President-elect Donald Trump. Overnight, Russia launched a massive missile and drone strike clearly targeted at Ukraine's energy infrastructure. More than 1 million Ukrainians are reportedly without power as of this broadcast, and the temperature in Ukraine at this time of year is generally freezing or lower. President Putin said the raid was retaliation for Ukraine's recent first use of US-supplied long-range missiles on targets inside Russia. Alyona, first of all, it's a sort of a follow-up to what we were just talking about. How prepared are Ukrainians for another winter of this, especially when they know that during this winter on January 20th, Donald Trump will be sworn in once again as President of the United States, and he has promised to end this war. And it is hard to imagine that if he does that, the terms will be quite what Ukraine envisaged 3 years ago.
It's a little bit anxiety-inducing for Ukrainians. I'm seeing the almost twofold reaction. On the one hand, everyone is ready to move past the status quo, I guess, and this stalemate that Ukrainians kind of got used to under Biden administration, when you request and ask and hope for so much aid and weapons, and yet it never comes, especially when you need it most. So there is a hope that this will change, but for the better. But of course, everyone is very well aware of the risk of it completely winding down, and Ukraine potentially losing all of the support of its biggest supplier of weapons. But going into winter, again, Ukrainians are morally better prepared for this winter, and I felt that was quite reassuring. Every single hotel, restaurant, school, every single establishment had generators. Everyone is ready with their candles and batteries and power banks, etc. So they know what to expect. But at the same time, President Zelensky did say that it's going to be the toughest winter yet.
Michael, recent events in the Middle East should have reminded people that it's often the dynamic of warfare that when people anticipate an end to the fighting does actually escalate quite intensely as people try to entrench their positions to better position themselves for whatever negotiations may be coming up. Do you detect an amount of that from Russia, that it anticipates that Trump is going to try and force a bargain, so they are trying to assert themselves?
Absolutely. I mean, that's been the pattern for the past 2 or 3 weeks, and particularly this recent escalation, which is partly in response to the West giving permission for using missiles and artillery, long-range missiles, particularly inside Russian territory. I mean, it's a terribly cruel thing to do, to try to freeze people into surrender. But the one thing that he did say, or Medvedev, his sidekick, has said several times, is they would resort to nuclear weapons if the West actually threatened Russian territory. And the Chinese have made it pretty clear that they better not do that. So I don't think that is going to happen. So I think the escalation has been the use of these missiles, which is pretty terrible, but it's more symbolic than anything else. But clearly they are anticipating a deal being put forward. Possibly Donald Trump would want to say, he's doing it, but actually I think the real players will probably be the Chinese, because they're the only ones who could push Russia in any direction towards some kind of compromise that would be vaguely acceptable. I mean, whatever the deal, it's going to be very unfavorable for Ukraine. But the Chinese could make it something, if they wished to, that Russia would have to swallow. And I think that is on the cards, not till Putin realizes that he's not going to get a better deal from Trump.
I mean, Aliona, it must be extremely difficult for Ukraine's government and indeed for Ukraine's people to try and figure out what on earth Donald Trump's return is going to mean, because on the one hand, he has nominated people for positions like Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, who are pretty historically solid on Ukraine, but however, he is, of course, taking counsel from Elon Musk, most notably his Vice President, J.D. Vance, who are less solid on Ukraine. And somewhere amid all that, he has nominated an envoy to Ukraine and Russia. This is Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg. Now, from what you've been able to glean about Keith Kellogg, and I'm sure tens of millions of Ukrainians have been reading his CV minutely over the last week, does that fill you with optimism or otherwise?
So as a former national security advisor, I think the first thing that is reassuring is that he knows exactly what he's talking about. He's actually an expert in this field because, as you've mentioned, Elon Musk, who seemed to have joined the very first call that Trump had with Zelensky, that seemed quite, if not amateur, then just full-on ridiculous. And what kind of advice would Elon Musk have for Trump and Zelensky on that call? So at least there's a grown-up in the room, or so we all hope, who is not perhaps willing to give Ukraine everything it needs to achieve victory. And for Ukraine, I will remind for everyone that victory remains the same. It's the return to our internationally recognized borders of 1991, including returning Crimea. For that, of course, we would need significantly more weapons than we had to date, and we're not expecting that from Kellogg. But one thing that we could expect is achieving, I guess, what President Zelensky has been highlighting and what Ronald Reagan first introduced, peace through strength. So forcing Russia to join negotiations on the terms that Ukraine is going into those negotiations with a strong position. And if Russia doesn't follow the lead and is not being reasonable, which it has the tendency not to be, then Ukraine will be provided with the means to force it into some sort of reason. And at this point, that's about as much as we could hope for. And on the other hand, I think the appointment of Mike Waltz, for me personally, was quite good news because I had the chance to meet him.
This is the NSA.
The current National Security Advisor, indeed. I had the chance to meet him last year twice at the Reagan forums in the U.S., and while he didn't vote for the aid package for Ukraine that was stuck in the Congress, and he was quite critical of Europe not pulling its weight, but at the same time, he was not willing to abandon Ukraine or to let the adversaries of America to take the lead in the world.
Well, let's move on somewhat. And during this year's general election campaign in the UK, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer was liable to flinch at the least, flee at the most, from any conjunction of the letters E and U. Even 8 years after the Brexit referendum, the issue remains spectacularly divisive. The election safely won. The Prime Minister is perhaps able to relax somewhat on this front. It has been confirmed that in February, Starmer will go to Belgium to meet the leaders of the 27 remaining EU states to discuss matters of mutual interest, especially the security of a continent squeezed by a revanchist Russia at one end and possibly abandoned by an indifferent United States at the other. Michael, does this strike you as something that was basically always going to happen, whatever the circumstances, that Starmer would gradually try to find some kind of way back to Europe?
Yes, I think it was, but it's been hugely accelerated by one single 5-letter word, and that is Trump. The fact that Trump has now won the election means that there is going to be much more nervousness in Europe that America will withdraw, not from NATO completely, but withdraw much of its support, or that it will actually have Europe as a much lower priority, and therefore the need for European collective security is all the greater. And with that, Britain does play a very important role, because Britain and France have the only two nuclear powers in Europe, and they are basically the two strongest military forces, although I have to say Britain is much undermined and much weakened as a military force, but nevertheless, Europe needs to cooperate in security, but Britain also needs to cooperate in a whole series of other ways. For example, on trade. If tariffs are suddenly imposed on all foreign countries, that would hit the European Union very hard. Britain perhaps slightly less hard, as we export more services than goods. But nevertheless, Britain does need to get much closer to Europe. The difficulty is, does the Labour Party have to choose between Europe or America? And that is an almost impossible choice, which Starmer is going to try to fudge. Nevertheless, moving closer to Europe is clearly a vital strategic interest.
Now, Allian, on the question of security in particular, we have talked about this before, that possibly the great, if not the sole redeeming aspect of Boris Johnson's premiership was that he did get out in front on Ukraine, he did lead on Ukraine, and he did kind of drag quite a lot of the Western world along with him. Is it better for Ukraine, therefore, if the UK is cooperating with the EU on defence matters to the extent that it ever did in olden times, or would Ukraine feel happier if the UK was sort of operating on its own? Because this is an area in which there has not been a massive deviation following the change of government. Starmer has been very supportive of Ukraine.
I think for Ukrainians, it's not as much the matter of UK's involvement in formulating the EU policy on Ukraine or on defence of Europe in general. It's about the UK having its own agency and still being a strong supporter, and whether it is leading from within the EU or externally. All it matters is the level of support. But I think for the UK, that was to be expected, that they would need to play a stronger role in Europe, whether they are a member of European Union or not. Because when speaking to many European partners of the UK, not allies so much anymore. First of all, they're all relying on UK's nuclear deterrent, because in Europe, that's the strongest case that the UK has. France has its nuclear weapons, but it's not dedicated to NATO. So if the Article 5 were to be invoked in Europe, it will turn first of all to the UK and then to the US as Germany would. And secondly, UK is a leader in JEF, Joint Expeditionary Force, which is a community of 10 now also NATO members, Northern European countries, and that gives it strong agency all the way to Eastern Europe of setting the tone for many of the defence reforms that EU inevitably has to go through.
I mean, is it a reach, Michael, to detect in these steps the first gestures towards maybe the UK trying to find its way back to the EU in some shape or form? As I was saying, Starmer has not wanted to entertain that conversation at all because many of his coalition of voters were those Labour people in the north of the country who voted Leave in 2016. But do you get the sense that this Labour Party does realise, even if it won't say it out loud, that this is going to come up at some point?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the figures just speak for themselves. The fact that our trade with Europe has been really hurt by the new arrangements, the new trade, not only trade, but, movement of people. I mean, all sorts of things. There's real buyer's regret in Britain about Brexit, not just from the Ramonas, as the opponents would say, but from a lot of people realising the hard facts are pretty difficult. I don't think it's a step towards future membership, at least not for a generation. That seems impossible. But it's a step towards becoming Switzerland. In other words, a country that basically, for all intents and purposes, has a very intense relationship with Europe in every field. And we'll start by knitting all those things together that have got broken, such as police cooperation in science, for example, the Horizon scheme, cooperation in various other youth employment schemes or youth work exchanges, things of that kind, so that gradually we relink ourselves to all those bits of Europe that have mattered to us, possibly allowing British people to stay more than the 90 days that they've been now told they can only stay in a European country. All those things. I mean, eventually the logic is, yes, we get back into the EU, but I think emotionally that's almost impossible for at least a generation.
I mean, it is very plausible, Alyona, that Ukraine will join the European Union before the United Kingdom rejoins it. But nonetheless, even if it's not Starmer, however long he stays in power, what kind of opinion polling numbers do you think a UK government would want to be looking at before it even articulated the idea out loud? Because a YouGov poll, at least in August, said 59 to 41 would vote for rejoin if another referendum was held tomorrow. But the thing is, nobody's calling that referendum unless they are absolutely certain, are they?
See, I think even current numbers would be probably enough to put the UK back on track towards long-lost partner in the European Union. I did hear a conversation that was held under Chatham House rules in Cambridge just before the elections, where Labour future government officials were saying that, answering the question whether they would put the question back onto the vote to the people. And they were, as you mentioned, very careful about not spoiling their success that they were going for during the elections. But they said if it's definitely not in 5 years' time, that's not going to be a question. But if they manage to get the second term, that they will certainly arrange a poll and put that question to people at the end of their second term. So let's wait and see.
Well, to France now, and specifically to the peculiar determination of the people who live therein, that their fabulous and lavishly blessed nation, a veritable cornucopia of splendours that attracts more tourists than any other country on earth, is in fact a miserable, decrepit hellhole in which the living should envy the dead. Displaying characteristic Gallic gloominess, according to a new poll by IFOP Judicial, fully 53% of French people actually want the government of Prime Minister Michel Barnier to fall, and that 67% are incensed by Barnier's plans to cut France's hilarious public deficit by slashing spending and hiking taxes. Michael, people who listen to our broadcasts from Paris during the Olympic Games will be aware that this was a recurring topic of conversation with our French guests, who all acknowledge that, yes, we live in an absolutely wonderful country, which we spend most of our lives complaining about for some reason. I mean, I might say, Michael, much though it pains me as an Australian, that the English are much the same. You have here a perfectly serviceable country, which you do spend an awful lot of time whining about. But are the French, do you think, actually unusually peevish, or do we just enjoy making fun of them?
Well, they're much more given to direct action. I mean, particularly farmers, though I think the British farmers may soon be taking a leaf out of the French book on that one. But they are much more vocal and they're much more volatile in many ways. And the institutions of democracy, though very democratic, very firm, have been much more up and down than Britain's have. I mean, we're into the Fifth Republic, as it were. I mean, it's only 1958 when the present Republic came into being, after de Gaulle found that the previous one was simply unworkable. And I think that the French do feel that, the state, they do have a very high conception and a high level of regard for the state, but the state is regarded very highly because it is very generous to its people. I mean, the benefits that French people have are tremendous. I mean, a lot of things work in that sense, but it comes at a cost. And taxes are high, and the French have been living beyond their means for some years. And nothing is more painful than having to tighten your belt, and particularly if you lose some of your benefits. So whatever Barnier tries to do, however much it's logical and sensible and economically important, if the left and the right, sensing the popular mood, vote against him, he's done for. And then, goodness knows what happens, because is then France ungovernable?
Well, people have been asking themselves this question for centuries, usually while they're actually attempting to govern it. Aldiona, coming from a country having Ukraine's present difficulties, though, does it strike you, because it often strikes me, and I come from a country, Australia, which, grand scheme of things, has almost no difficulties, that this is a tendency, I think you could almost chart it on a sliding scale. The more comfortable and secure and basically well-off people are, the more they feel like probably they've got the freedom to complain about their lot.
Well, first of all, for a second there during your introduction, I thought you almost forgot that you were Australian and that you turned into a full-on Brit by the things you said about the French. I think that's one thing I've learned about the Brits so far. And I take great joy in joining that banter whenever I can now, having a second British passport too. When it comes to, I guess we're talking about complacency to an extent, perhaps as rude as it will sound. When you're used to a certain level of comfort, just like Michael was saying about the French, and you begin to lose it gradually, and we have all had quite tough years. We have to remember that it all started with COVID. That was absolutely unprecedented for our generation occurrence, and we didn't know who's going to come out alive and what economies will survive and industries, etc. And then the war in Europe started, and then the war in the Middle East started, and then tensions with China rise. The whole supply chain globally is getting reorientated. The UN no longer serves the purpose. People don't know where this whole world is going, and the climate crisis might strike any time. So who knows? Maybe we will face one of those apocalyptic moments of those movies where we all freeze to death or hit something deadly to all of us. So it's not, I guess, surprising that people have their limits The people are reaching their limits with patience. But nonetheless, even when I get slightly comfortable and start moaning like a true Brit, I'm beginning to inherit that trait now. All it takes is going to my home country, Ukraine, and seeing how difficult life is there. So I think just reminding ourselves and looking at those tough areas that sometimes we would not want to look towards is a good sobering mechanism to be grateful for what we have.
Well, to South Australia now, which believes it might have solved the wrangles over political donations which beset many democracies. South Australia's state parliament has voted, and across party lines, to ban them. The new law will forbid electoral donations and gifts to political parties, MPs and candidates. The downside is the counter-argument often put when this notion is floated elsewhere. An extra 18 million Australian dollars will be drawn from taxpayer funds. But mandatory expenditure caps will also be imposed on parties and candidates. Michael, are you a fan of this idea?
Not really. I think it's a bit awkward. I think when you get state-funded elections, it becomes very difficult for any new idea or new party to get going because it's not there. I mean, it hasn't come into existence. And unless they're allowed to get money and support and enthusiasm from new voters and say, we are now a party, how could they appeal for state funds when they're not really even a party yet? So essentially, it's simply reinforcing the status quo. And I'm not sure that that is very healthy for politics to be sort of fossilized in the shape that it's in.
I mean, is there an argument, though, Aliona, that nevertheless, and Michael does make a fair point, that this may have, I guess, an uplifting effect on policy making if there's no mileage for politicians in making policy to please the people who paid for their campaigns? That this does away with, well, to cite that great American political wisdom that you dance with who brung you.
Well, having spent good 10 years of my life in Ukrainian politics, one lesson I've learned is that whether you're funded by the government mostly or by your voters, you still kind of tend to dance to whatever you're being dictated to. So inevitably, I think that could almost be a waste of state money, and politics are better left to be competitive. And, market still applies even to politics. Whoever wins most favorable donations, they go into politics.
But is the best argument in favour of this, and I'm arguing for the literal land of my father here, that's where my dad is from, South Australia, though I don't actually know what he thinks of this. But what we have just witnessed in the United States, Michael, is that not the ultimate argument in favour of this? Is that we have an American political system in which people once elected spend more time running to get re-elected than they do actually governing. Enormous amounts of money get raised and spent, and people, as we have witnessed, who have lots of money, do to a very large extent get to choose who wins.
Yes, I mean, the American example is the leading example of what could happen and how it could go wrong. And it's certainly true that most politicians spend all the time worrying about, A, how to get the money, and then B, how to get themselves re-elected. And one tends to lead to the other. And the problem is there that big donors tend to have big influence. But I would say not overwhelmingly. You see, it's still the case that in Britain, donors have some influence, but not overwhelmingly. I mean, you might say the Labour Party, is it funded entirely by the trade unions? Well, the answer is, in principle, the trade unions are the biggest donors. But actually, when you look at the policy Labour has had in the past, and possibly even now, they haven't really been particularly favourable to trade unions. And similarly, Conservatives, are they funded by big business? Well, the Conservatives have done things that big business don't really like. I think European governments tend to be much more independent of the donors. Yes, in America, they have got spending more or less runaway out of control. But at the same time, they have themselves tried to limit donations. I mean, the political action committees, these things were set up to try to limit who gives what and make it clear and open and make people understand where the money's coming from and where it's going. Of course, in America, money does speak. But if so many competitive and competing influences are pouring in money, the result is you get a bit of a sort of balance all the way around.
Just finally and quickly on this, Alyona, I'm trying to split the difference here. Is there an argument in favour of this kind of thing? And I'm thinking back to your experiences as a regional MP in Ukraine, that in relatively, no disrespect to South Australia, at relatively low levels of government with small electorates, is there an argument for this? South Australia, it's only 1.2 million registered voters. It is only a state government. And at that level, wouldn't it be better if MPs were doing things like, actually doing state-level governance stuff rather than wondering who was paying for their next campaign?
But at the same time, if the people are involved and if they actually have to do something useful for the people, for them to re-elect them again, to give them the mandate to have their support political activity, etc., isn't that the quickest way to them achieving success? Because you have a flip side to that, where you know that you have secured government or state funding, and then you barely have to do anything at all because you know that you're safe and you get complacent.
Alyona Livko and Michael Binion, thank you both for joining us. Now, finally on today's show, today is Thanksgiving in the United States, and all the very best to our American listeners. We give thanks indeed for you listening. And for many Americans, Thanksgiving means family, food and football, and it also means that once again millions of people are travelling to see their loved ones and possibly designing strategies to forestall any discussion of politics across the turkey. For this week's regular segment, a letter from reporter H.J. Mai went to Washington, D.C.'s Union Station to see how the railroad operator Amtrak prepares for the holiday rush.
This year's Thanksgiving holiday is set to be another record-breaking one. The American Automobile Association, or AAA for short, projects that nearly 80 million Americans will travel this week. The vast majority will drive, but Amtrak, the government-owned rail operator in the United States, is also preparing for new highs.
We're expecting a bigger crowd even than we had last year. The last few months, we've really seen that year over year breaking records over ridership.
That's Tracy Winbigler, Amtrak's chief financial officer. Last year, Amtrak counted over 1 million passengers on its trains during Thanksgiving. To prepare for even more guests this year, the company is adding more trains.
On the Northeast corridor, we added some cars to some of the regional trains, as well as we've added some frequencies to the Northeast corridor to help with this high demand season as well. So we really want to help everybody get to their holiday celebrations.
The Northeast corridor that Winbigler is talking about is the crown jewel in Amtrak's network. It connects Washington, D.C. to Boston via New York City, and it is by far the busiest and most profitable passenger rail sector in the whole country. Adding additional capacity to this vital part of the system is therefore not easy, says Winbigler.
It's a balancing act for us every day to make sure that we have the capacity for our customers, but also keep working on that future capacity with some of those investments coming.
As part of President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law that Congress passed in 2021, Amtrak received $66 billion. And certain parts of its network, including the Northeast Corridor, are in desperate need of upgrades. Train delays and cancellations due to old and failing infrastructure are not uncommon.
People want to feel like they're going fast, and when they have to slow down on a curb or for an old piece of infrastructure like the tunnel, they're like,
Improvements may encourage more Americans to ditch their cars in favor of the train. People like Gary Peterson, who did not plan to take the train this weekend at all.
Just a little bit of holiday snafu. So I originally had a car rental reservation. There was an issue with the reservation. Now they don't have any cars.
At that point, Amtrak was his best option.
Really just the convenience of the schedule and accessibility of getting to Union Station is not far away.
Peterson says he would consider riding the train more often if the service would improve.
It's dated. They haven't really updated the trains at all. The Wi-Fi never works. It's overpriced for what it is.
Another passenger waiting for her boarding call at Union Station was Shannon, who declined to provide her last name. She was on her way to New Jersey to spend time with her family over the holidays. And while she likes riding the train, she would prefer faster travel times.
I think that the trains could be faster. I mean, I was just looking, my train to New York Penn Station is going to take 3.5 hours, which is about as long as it would take to drive, without the traffic.
As the crowds at Washington's Union Station come and go on this Wednesday before Thanksgiving, the shops inside the transit hub welcome to potentially record-breaking foot traffic. Several stores on the main concourse of the train station saw a steady flow of customers. One of them was a chocolate store.
Laderack is a Swiss chocolate company, family-owned, family-operated.
Sherry is a shift supervisor and has been working at the store since January.
Milk chocolate hazelnut, that's our number one seller. Our second seller here is that strawberry curd. It's white chocolate, freeze-dried strawberries, Rice Krispies, and yogurt. It's really good, one of my favorites.
Sherry, who's a DC native, says things are looking up again after several stores closed during the pandemic.
Business in Union Station is crazy. You're around everybody. We have the trains, we have metro, buses, so we stay busy.
Union Station, which is only a stone's throw away from the U.S. Capitol, also offered live musical entertainment for travelers. Amtrak, on its Northeast Corridor, experienced only a few delays on Wednesday. But the real test for its service will come on Sunday, when millions of Americans are heading back home. Amtrak's Win Bigler thinks her team is ready to take on that challenge.
We're excited for the demand that we're seeing.
For Monocle, I'm HJMI at Union Station in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, HJ, and once again, happy Thanksgiving to all our American listeners. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Alyona Lifko and Michael Binion. Today's show was produced by Carlotta Rebello and researched by Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.